Hi, welcome to the Making of Madrid podcast. I'm Felicity Hughes, your host. I'm a journalist and tour guide, and you may have seen my work about Madrid in Lonely Planet or the Financial Times. This particular episode is an absolute treat. The podcast in general covers all aspects of life in Madrid, but history is my grand passion, and I managed to grab historian Caroline Fish just before she went back to the States to talk about Juana of Austria. And it's just so much fun talking to somebody who's telling the untold stories of women and about how women actually had quite a bit of power in Renaissance Spain. So let's just take it away and listen to Caroline because she's a really engaging speaker. Hello, I'm here with Caroline Fish and we're in Gran Via. It's quite glamorous because I couldn't trust my cats today to stay quiet. And she's a historian who came here to Madrid on a Fulbright scholarship, and she's investigating a really interesting area, which is ambassadresses. So before we get going, can you tell me a little bit about that?
Yeah, so an ambassadress or embajadora in Spanish, was the usually wife of an ambassador who, when he was named to go to a foreign court like in Vienna or in Rome, often the ambassadors would bring their wives. And over time, they developed the feminized term ambassadors to sort of denote that she had a special status because she was the wife of a recognized ambassador of the Spanish king. And this actually started in a lot earlier than we would think it was. It actually started around 14th century in Italy, because all the small Italian states would always constantly be sending representatives to one another. So they would bring along their wives, their children, extended households, sometimes with hundreds of people. And then eventually that spread out into the rest of Europe. So I'm looking at the Spanish ambassadresses, the embajadoras, mainly in what we now think of as the sort of early modern period or the Renaissance. So 16th century, 17th century, late 1500s to the end of the 1600s, mainly looking at how do they use that position as embajadora to act as diplomatic agents on their own terms. How do they promote their husband's embassy missions while also usually promoting the political or financial health of their families?
Mm-hmm. And so women with a certain amount of power in this period is your thing, right?
Yes, very much so. So I really specialize I technically specialize in women and diplomacy, but what that really means is I specialize in aristocratic women and diplomacy. These were women who were raised from birth to be political agents on behalf of their husbands, their children, themselves, their larger family units. So we have this kind of notion that marriage and that womanhood was sort of a trap, that you had to follow all these rules about piety and sexuality and how you couldn't behave. But that was much more of a religious doctrine and not so much how things were actually done in practice. Because we're talking about a time when 1 in 3 children wouldn't live past infancy sometimes. So you can't have a family that's only relying on the men to do everything. The women are just as essential. Depending on which area of Europe you're talking about, that power can differ. In some places, they didn't have, say, rights to property. But when we're talking about Spain specifically, Castile, Aragon, Portugal, these are women whose power is enshrined in culture, practice, and even law. So these were women who knew how to obtain power and how to use it. So when they get sent to somewhere like Rome, they know already what the game's up. They are prepared and ready to execute, essentially.
And during this research, what has been your most exciting find in an archive or your most exciting discovery?
There are a lot. So that's sort of a difficult question to answer, but I think I'll talk about the sort of discovery that actually inspired my dissertation project on these ambassadors. As I originally was I was doing my master's degree, and I was originally writing about male ambassadors, so the husband side. I was specifically looking at one, Diego Sarmiento de Acuña, who eventually becomes first Count of Gondomar, who is sent to the court of James I in London, becomes very good friends with the king. And I was writing about his first embassy, which is from 1613 to 1618, so early 17th century. And was here in Madrid on a research project, or just on a research trip, and came across a bunch of letters written by Gondomar's confessor, which was basically his main spiritual advisor. So somebody very, very close to him who knew all the inner workings of the embassy. And came across this letter that mentioned the Count's wife, Constanza, which stood out because it was the first time I'd seen her brought up at all in the documents or in the research from actual scholars. She rarely was mentioned anywhere. No footnotes, not even if you looked in the indexes in a lot of these biographies, nothing about her. So I was wondering, well, what is this? And I read further, and I realized that this letter detailed plan from King Philip III of Spain, so the King of Spain, to send Gondomar's wife from London to France as basically like a diplomatic spy. Set her up in the household of the Queen of France, who was also Philip III's daughter, Ana Mauricia de Austria, and basically serve as a secret agent on behalf of the Spanish crown, because even though the Spanish princess had married the King of France and became the Queen of France, the relationship was not good. That is a very fraught marriage. He was actually Louis XIII, a horrible husband. Horrible, horrible husband. And so tensions were very high between France and Spain at that time. The most recent ambassador had just left, so they needed somebody to go to Paris and basically report back on what was happening until they could get a new official ambassador in there. So there was this whole plan to take a Spanish embajadora based in London and essentially make her own sort of embassy unto herself unofficially in France. So, of course, that made me wonder, well, who else is doing these kind of covert operations? And then it started expanding out into, well, we don't even have a list of who these women were. We have lists of all the ambassadors. We don't know when they would go with their wives, when their wives weren't there. So this developed into a project that's far, far bigger, but it started with this one 2-page letter that I happened to accidentally find here in Madrid going on 7 or 8 years ago. And I've turned it into my life.
Right. That's why I wanted you on the podcast, because you were speaking very entertainingly about looking through the accounts of an ambassadress in Italy. I've forgotten what was the city state? It was it Naples or?
Were we talking about
the spices?
The spices that was in Rome.
Yeah.
Yeah.
You were gleaning things from these documents that people don't normally look at.
Yeah. And admittedly, what also kind of happens when we do diplomatic history is, especially when it comes to the Spanish monarchy, there's a lot of documentation. The Spaniards were kind of hoarders when it came to paperwork. They loved paperwork. So all letters that were sent to the king's advisory councils in Madrid, here in Madrid, they had to be made in triplicate. They had to be specially stored. So we have just a lot of stuff to comb through. There's things in the archives that we just don't know are there 500 years later, simply because when we've been cataloging or looking through, someone missed a box somewhere. So what's kind of fun about it is not only are we just identifying these women and what they're doing, but we're also uncovering new things even within those that could be used for completely different diplomatic projects unrelated to women, because it's the first time we're really going through those documents in a new way.
It's great. It's showing another dimension to history that, has always been a lot told from a male perspective.
Yes, yeah. And that's also been something really exciting for the last 50 years or so. We've had women's history as like a separate field, but that's now breaking off into its own little subcategories because we're getting so specialized in it now. So, for instance, I do aristocratic women and I do diplomacy, but my supervisor, who is advising me on my dissertation, she doesn't do aristocratic women. She doesn't do diplomacy. She actually does queenship and regency, specifically on one queen. Oh. And so, but we can still talk and collaborate, even though we're technically in our own separate spheres. But that's what's so exciting about where history is now. And it's kind of trickling out into the public history too. We now finally we have recognition at the Prado Museum, which of course, if anyone hasn't been to it, please go. It is fantastic. They only just updated the nameplate for Mary the First of England at the Prado next to her famous portrait that says she was Queen Regnant of England. That wasn't there before. Oh, okay. That's only recently been added, in part because there's so much work that has been done on our end that's now becoming more popular with the public, which is also very exciting to see.
And there's a Sofonisba portrait of Philip II.
Yes.
I love that one.
There's a lot of wonderful portraits at that museum. I stand there for hours sometimes.
Well, we're going to talk about someone in particular. Have you seen a portrait of her? It's Juana of Austria.
Yes, there is actually... have you been to the new Colección Real that just opened last year? Yeah. There is a portrait of her there. There's a couple of others. I believe there's one at the Prado. I'm pretty sure there is. At least one.
It might not be on display because they've got such a big collection.
Yes, and I know that there's things that have been either loaned out to other museums. I believe one might be at the, I think it's the Rijksmuseum Museum in Belgium. So some of these also have been either they're being cleaned sometimes, they're just not on display because they have so much, or they're just in other countries and I haven't seen them.
So we're talking about her in relation to the Monasterio de las Descalzas Reales de Madrid. I wanted to add this side note because I'm confused about the difference between conventos and monasterios. I don't know if you can clarify that.
So they actually used to be interchangeable. The kind of idea of a monasterio only being for male monks and a convent being only for female nuns is a much more recent gendering of the term. It used to be that it was much more related to enclosure versus just living alone. So monasterio etymologically comes from a term just to live alone, to live in seclusion. So it really meant like removal from society into the monastery for spiritual thinking and philosophy and processing, whereas convento was more about enclosure within that space, but in terms of actual like daily use, exactly the same.
Oh, thank you for clearing that.
And it's very confusing. I had the same thought. I was going through the records of a different royal convento and was wondering, why are there men here? Why are there monks in a convent? But it was because the terms were essentially interchangeable.
Well, we've chosen this convent because it's connected to this very powerful woman, but it's also a fantastic place to visit that is often off the radar for tourists. We'll get to that towards the end, but let's get into Juana, who founded this monastery, but that wasn't the beginning of her life. So where should we start? Right. So the building itself was a palace used by Carlos I, who was her father.
Carlos the First or Carlos the Fifth is usually how you'll hear him referred to.
He has so many titles,
Yeah.
I never know how to refer to him.
I mean, the man ruled 14% of the landmass on Earth in his lifetime. So Carlos the First is his title as King of Castile.
Mm-hmm.
And his title as Holy Roman Emperor in what is now Germany, Austria, sort of that Western Central Europe, was Charles V. So we refer to him as Charles V because technically he is called Holy Roman Emperor Charles V or Carlos V, but he is also Charles I.
Yeah, I see him a lot as Carlos I, I guess in Spanish.
Yes, because that's referring to his title as King of Castile,
right?
Which is old. He actually has that title first, and then he becomes Carlos V 3 years later. So that's why you'll see him with multiple different names, but it's all the same guy.
So pretty powerful guy. And her brother is Philip II, who was to become King of Spain.
Yes.
Were they close as children?
Very, very close. This is actually something that we see in a lot of royal children, but especially when we talk about the Spanish and Portuguese royal children. So in Spain, you have kind of two dynasties that we're talking about. You have the Trastamara, which is the predecessors of Charles V. His mother, Juana, was a Trastamara, his grandmother and his grandfather, who of course are the Catholic monarchs that are so famous in world history, Isabella and Ferdinand. And then when you get to the Habsburgs, which is Charles's dynasty, it's the name from his father, Philip the Fair, both of these dynasties adopt a specific household structure that basically encourages the children to be very close together. And when we talk about royal households, what that means is not just, oh, there's a house where people live. It means more the like social, financial sphere around a royal person. Mm-hmm. So a king would have a household and a queen would have a house. They could be in a palace together, but their separate households would have their own servants, their own spaces, their own financing. And royal children in the Spanish monarchy and in Portugal grew up usually in their mother's household altogether. Mm-hmm. So the children there wasn't like a separate nursery or anything like that. The children wouldn't be sent away usually to grow up with another family. They would grow up with their mother and all of their mother's servants. So usually what that meant is that the children spent a lot of time together. They would be educated together. They would play together. They would go to events. They would travel in carriages together. So when you're looking at the Spanish royal children, these are children who develop bonds almost immediately with one another. And those are then reinforced throughout their childhoods. So what's really interesting to kind of demonstrate how close Philip and Juana and their other sister Maria were, their mother, Empress Isabel, dies when they're still children. Mm-hmm. I believe Philip was 11, somewhere between 8 and 11 years old. Juana was very young, and Maria was only a year younger than Philip. So their father, when a queen dies, her household, which means all of her servants and stuff, is usually what's called dissolved, meaning that household no longer exists. Mm-hmm. Charles then sets up a separate household for Philip, and then a separate household for the two girls, Maria and Juana, and physically separates them from each other. He actually sends the girls out into the countryside, which was very strange, but he did it. Philip refused to be cut off from his sisters. He wrote to them constantly. He wanted to see them. He was obsessed with wanting to be reunited with them because they were very close that very close relationship, that source of consolation and familiarity was suddenly gone. Mm-hmm. And that also relationship drives a lot of Philip's reign because his sisters are such prominent figures, not only in his life, but in the whole political realm of Europe.
Right. But of course, do they get to see each other before Juana gets married off?
Yes, they do. They actually, Philip and Juana actually do part of the journey towards Portugal together. So Juana marries when she's 16 years old. She's married to her cousin, who is the Prince of Portugal, Jean Manuel. He's 2 years younger than her, and she's going to make her bridal journey from Spain to Portugal to have her sort of official marriage, because usually you had a proxy marriage before, and then they have the actual grand wedding. Philip accompanies her on part of that journey as a sort of final goodbye, thinking, I may never see her again, or I might. So I have to make the most of this last potential moment we have together.
That's kind of cute.
But of course, even when they're separated, these siblings are constantly writing to each other. There's actually something quite funny about their other sister, Maria, who marries the Holy Roman Emperor. There's a whole story about that. But she goes to live in Vienna, and Maria had horrible handwriting. For as educated they all were, she could never quite fix her penmanship. But Philip could always read them. So we today struggle to read her letters, but her brother, who knew her so well, could read them fluently without problem.
Philip was famous for loving correspondence.
Yes, he loved paperwork. He actually was the one who established the first official archive in Spain. He founded what is the Archivo General de Simancas, just outside of Valladolid, about an hour or so north of Madrid by train, just to hold all of his paperwork and his father's. And that archive still exists. If anyone who's listening to this is going to go to Valladolid, go to Simancas, because you can actually tour. There is a museum at that archive. It's still operating. I was just there last week. It is an old military fortress. So they have armory collections. It's fantastic.
Oh, wow.
It's a beautiful
I think
building.
I would geek out there.
Yeah.
And so tell me about this marriage to her cousin. So this is really common in the Habsburgs. They love to get married to each other. And they had a son pretty quickly, right? Did they have any issues with interbreeding at all that we know of?
So, no. And when we talk, especially when we talk about the Habsburgs, we tend to overemphasize the intermarriage aspect. Not because they didn't do it, but because every royal family was doing it.
Right.
But of course, it's what the Habsburgs are famous for. People go to the Prado, they look at the portraits of Philip II, third, fourth, Carlos II, and they go, something's going on with that person's DNA.
Well, I actually think that Carlos V, he naturally had a large jaw and he wasn't interbred. And it was a non-regressive trait he passed on. But the last one, Charles II, I think he was the one in which you could see it, and he was called El Hechizado, and it was such a mess.
Which is a horrible, horrible nickname that they gave to him after he died. Because he was nothing like that when he was alive.
I should say El Hechizado means the cursed one.
The bewitched, yes. And partly it was because after Charles II dies in 1700, the French dynasty comes in, which is the Bourbons, who are still the ruling family of Spain. And they sort of delegitimize him as the last Habsburg king. And they really pick on his physical appearance in particular. And they make up all these stories about him, that he could barely eat, that he could barely talk, he couldn't walk, basically being very ableist towards a person who had none of those problems in real life. All that is made up but reinforced by the portraits that were painted of him while he was alive. He actually was a fantastic hunter. He loved to dance. He was considered like one of the most graceful dancers in Europe. But when we talk about the Habsburgs, going even all the way back to Juana and Jean Manuel, the intermarriage thing often gets very heavily emphasized with them as a sort of way to legitimize the Bourbons who come later. Had very little to do what was actually going on while the Habsburgs were ruling. Because what we sort of miss out when we talk about the intermarriage thing is, well, why would they do that so many times in a row? Because Juana and Jean Manuel were not just first cousins, they were first cousins multiple times over.
Mm-hmm.
So Juana's mother, Isabel, was a Portuguese princess, but also Charles's great-grandmother was a Portuguese princess, and his aunt married a different Portuguese king. So there are multiple marriages in a row in the direct line between the Aves dynasty in Portugal and the Trastamara/Habsburgs in Spain. Now, when it comes to Jean Manuel and Juana, their son Sebastian, as far as I'm aware, had no issues whatsoever. There were no medical problems. He actually died in battle at the age of 24. Jean Manuel, Juana's husband, may have had something. They think he may have had diabetes or another ailment, but whether that was due to intermarriage repeatedly, we don't know.
And were they happily married?
Very happily married. Perhaps because they were of fairly similar age. He was 14, she was 16. They got along really well by all accounts. They were happy. Apparently she made him laugh. She was quite a headstrong woman, as a lot of Habsburg women were. She was very self-assured, very independent, but also we have reports that Juana was a very caring person. She actually took responsibility for his health as soon as they got married, because he was sort of known to be quite sickly. So when he would have bouts of illness, she would actually take care of him, which was very unusual for a married couple, because, of course, this is the heir to the Portuguese throne. He should have the best medical practitioners. But no, she wanted to take care of him.
And they had a child quite quickly?
Yes, Sebastian, who is actually their only child, because Jean Manuel dies, I think it's something like a week before their second anniversary.
Oh my.
Their marriage is very short-lived. He dies at 16.
Do we know what he died of?
We aren't quite sure. It could have been a number of things. It could have been something to deal with an abnormality in his production of insulin, or it could have been something else like typhus or numerous other diseases. We have some ideas based on the accounts, but of course, names for medical maladies back in the day were quite different from how we understand them now.
And yeah, so he dies and she's just 18.
Yes.
And is this around the time that Philip II asks her to become regent for him?
Yes. So it's all very much right in a row. So Juana leaves Castile to marry Jean Manuel at the same time that her brother marries Jean Manuel's sister, Maria Manuela. Maria Manuela also gets pregnant quite quickly and dies as a result of complications in childbirth. So Philip II is left a widower. Juana is then pregnant, and Jean Manuel dies, and they actually don't tell her that he has died because she is near the end of her pregnancy, and they don't want her to lose the baby. So they hide his death for, I believe it's something like a month.
Wow.
Because she's, of course, in convalescence, she's being medically taken care of, the baby's been born, and then they tell her, and she goes into this quite deep state of mourning. Well, meanwhile, in Castile, Philip, he's been arranged to be married to another of their cousins, who is Mary Tudor, eventually Mary I of England. So he is currently, at the time, he is in Spain, ruling as regent on behalf of their father, who is actually away in Flanders, in what is now Belgium and parts of the Netherlands today. So if Philip is going to go marry his cousin Mary, well, he's regent. He's ruling in Castile on behalf of their father, so he can't just leave willy-nilly.
This feels like a telenovela.
This is the fun thing about doing aristocrats and royalty. It is a giant soap opera. Everybody's sleeping with each other or related to each other or getting in fights with each other. It's quite fun. So because Philip and Juana were so close as children, and it's really only been 2 years that they've been apart, he writes to her knowing that she's a widow and says, "Come home. You need to rule in my stead."
Right.
Which technically means rule in my stead instead of our father. So it's regencies multiple times over. And she does. She leaves behind her infant son and she never sees him again. Some people accuse her of being a bad mother, but it's really much more of a question of, I have a son who can be taken care of by his grandparents versus I have a duty to my family. And so she goes back to Castile and serves as regent for 2 years on behalf of her father between 1554 and 1556, and then for 3 years on behalf of her brother, because their father actually abdicates the throne in 1556.
So Philip's in England the whole time?
He's in England for 3 of those years. So he actually becomes King of Spain while he's in England, which is a whole thing.
And he's King of England.
Yes, he also is King of England. Well, he's actually not King of England. He is Prince of England. Because you can't have a queen regnant with their spouse having a higher title.
Right.
That's why Prince Philip was Prince Philip and not King Philip most recently.
Okay.
But then he goes to the Holy Roman Empire for his father's final abdications. And so then he's there for 2.5 years, and even thought about extending his stay in Central Europe because Juana was doing such a good job ruling.
So tell me about this. She's ruling Spain for 5 years.
Yes.
And what kind of challenges does she encounter?
Mainly her challenges had to do with sort of putting things in order for their father's abdication, because he abdicates in stages. So he first abdicates his titles in what is now Flanders and Belgium. Then he abdicates the Holy Roman Empire. Then he abdicates Spain. So it's a series of things. So there's a lot of bureaucratic stuff that she has to deal with. And then, of course, establishing her brother's image as the new king, because he's not in Spain to do this himself. So she's actually mainly doing a lot of the sort of image making work. That was something she and a lot of Habsburg women were very good at. Mary of Hungary actually did the same for Charles. His sister arranged. So the giant portrait of him that's in the Prado, it's this huge giant portrait, it takes up a whole wall. Of Charles. The one where he's on horseback with the
Tissue.
Yes, the giant. He petitioned to have that made on his behalf. So his sister actually arranged for the kind of image we still have of Charles as this warrior king. Well, Juana helps do the same thing for Philip in the first couple of years of his reign. And think about the fact that she's doing all of this and she's founding Descalzas Reales at the same time.
Okay.
Because she comes back to Spain in 1554, and that is when she purchases the palace that now makes up part of the convent. All these things are happening at the same time. So she's really taking advantage of this moment where she has essentially unlimited regental power to make a long-term political statement for the dynasty, not only in shaping how her brother's reign's going to go, and he rules for 40 years, more than 40 years, but also the long-term religious image of the family, which Descalzas Reales plays a huge part in.
Yes, he liked to project himself as being very devout, and he was as well, right? I mean, he liked to wear black and not... His outfits weren't that showy. He used to pray out in the San Jerónimo Real.
Yeah, the fashion stuff with Philip really has much more to do with a trend that comes out of Flanders than it does necessarily with religious devotion. Because it's called the Burgundian style of court, where monarchs are supposed to be very aloof. They're not supposed to interact with the court that much. They're very controlled, very pious. But that has more to do with how the court actually operated than necessarily his personal religious inclinations. But Philip was very devout. Pretty much all the Habsburgs are. They are their most Catholic monarchs. You can't have that kind of title and not try to live up to it. But Philip in particular, much like Juana, founds his own royal monastery at El Escorial, another fantastic place to go visit, which is also a royal site and a monastery at the same time, exactly the same as Descalzas Reales. He also was a massive collector of relics, so religious relics. He's said to have had as many as 7,000 at El Escorial. And this was something as small as a sliver of the cross, to bones of saints, to various other items that are said to have had holy healing properties. When he was dying in 1598, they actually would take, I believe it was the bones of Saint Anthony, and put them in bed with him to try to heal the ulcers that he was suffering.
That's some powerful juju. I heard that when Charles II was dying, he had they brought in the corpse of San Isidro.
Yes. That was they really did believe in the power of holy relics to at least ease the suffering of the body. And Philip II in particular was thought to have there was a concept of a good death, which was essentially that the body would be suffering, but the soul wouldn't feel it because they were so pious and so holy that their transcendence to heaven would have been like an ecstasy.
And was Juana into relics?
Yes, she wasn't an avid necessarily collector, but she would receive them. There are many that are kept at Descalzas Reales. She also had a massive art collection, part of which she then gave to the convent and is actually still kept there. So she had many paintings of religious significance that are still there.
So can you tell me about the order and why she founded it?
So what's kind of special about Descalzas Reales is that, like El Escorial, it is a royal convent, meaning that it is founded by the royal family for not only the use of that particular order, which is, I believe it's the Poor Clares.
Yes, I think so.
Yes, it is the Poor Clares, which they actually moved from Valladolid, which used to be sort of one of the potential capitals for Spain. They moved them from Valladolid down here to Madrid. But when you have a royal convent or a royal monastery, it's for the use of that order, but that also means it has a special significance to the royal family. So the founding of a royal convent is sort of a dual purpose. There's a religious inclination in it, in that we're going to build this beautiful religious site not only to venerate God and for the purposes of this order's spiritual pursuits, but also that it venerates us and the monarchy that established it. So that's why if you go to El Escorial, for instance, it's huge. It is a palace, a basilica, a monastery. It's multiple things at once because it's an intermeshing of religious significance with a political significance.
And would the general public or would the courtiers have any kind of access to these places at all, or were they completely enclosed?
They weren't completely enclosed, but getting access to them was difficult. Not so much with El Escorial, although Philip would routinely go there to escape his courtiers who he didn't like. He would go there for long periods of time as a retreat. But with Descalzas Reales in specific, because it was for nuns, getting access to Descalzas Reales was quite a bit harder. So it could kind of serve as a getaway for the royal family in Madrid, but also as a political site in that if you got access to Descalzas Reales, which required the approval of not only the Pope, but the royal family, that meant something really special.
Right. And so what kind of women did she surround herself with? Could she choose the women who would become nuns there, or?
Not so much that. That would have been up to the women who actually were in charge of that particular convent, the abbess and various other women of note. But what is interesting with Descalzas Reales is that a lot of the nuns are royal women.
Mm-hmm.
So, for instance, Juana lives there for an extended period of time. She never actually takes vows, but she is the first woman to unofficially join the Jesuits.
Mm-hmm.
She was kind of secretly allowed to join them.
Oh.
She never took formal vows, but that was, for a woman to join a male exclusive order was very unusual. Her sister, Maria, after she's widowed, her husband dies, she comes back to Spain and lives in Descalzas Reales with one of her daughters, who takes her vows as a nun and lives out the rest of her life there.
And Juana's like, finally, I thought something else was going on, but I didn't read your handwriting.
No, illegitimate daughters of various Habsburg relatives live there. It essentially becomes sort of this epicenter of royal power, not only because of, Maria or Juana being there and the fact that they founded the convent itself, but that you have royal women entering it as professants and you have aristocratic women joining it as well. Mm-hmm. So it becomes this sort of female power center outside of what is typically thought of as the royal court, but essentially acted as an extension of it. So do you think, how were their lives? Were they fairly pleasant in a place like this? Yes. So obviously when someone professed as a nun, usually they took certain vows of poverty or silence, depending on the order. They had different rules. But what usually happened when a woman, especially a woman of means, entered a convent, they brought with them money. Mm-hmm. Because, especially under Castilian law, women's right to property was a legal enshrined thing. So when women were given dowry to get married, that was their own property. Husbands administrated all that money, but it was still hers. Women could actually sue for bad management. They could sue their husbands if the money wasn't taken care of. So if a woman had a dowry but never got married and instead entered a convent, she brought that money with her. So usually they wouldn't be using it for things like daily expenses, because obviously the convent provided all those things, but they could use it for other things like purchasing of paintings, religious items, the improvement of the monastery itself. So we have records of certain nuns bringing in assets that are then used to improve the convent itself, which would in turn improve their daily surroundings. And did they have much of an intellectual life? Because you're saying Juana was a Jesuit, and I know that they were kind of connected with teaching and education. Yes, so convents often were sort of these female education centers because, of course, the whole point of entering a religious order is pursuit of sort of religious philosophy and thought. Mm-hmm. So we have records of nuns who were poets. We have records of nuns who wrote ecclesiastical texts. Juana herself was a avid patroness of various artists and thinkers and intellectuals throughout her life. Same with Maria, her sister. So there's production within the convent and also sponsorship of artistic production outside of it as well. And she continued her relationship with Philip, right? I think when I visited, they said that there was a room where he would come and visit her. Yes. So she actually kept 2 private quarters. She kept one at the Alcazar, which is the royal sort of fortified kind of a palace which no longer exists. That unfortunately was destroyed in, I believe, the 18th century. And then she kept...
1734.
Thank you. See, somebody knows the 18th century better than me. And then she kept another one at Descalzas Reales, where she actually hung up her art collection. And it was this stately quarter with velvet on the walls and all these huge paintings. So Philip would come visit her. He would bring his children, Isabella Clara Eugenia and Catalina Micaela, his daughters specifically. And he would also bring foreign dignitaries. It was sort of said that before you could properly talk to the king about anything, you had to go talk to Juana first. She was sort of she kind of sniffed out the fools for him a little bit.
So he trusted her judgment.
Yes. He trusted her almost implicitly because she understood him on a very deep level. And also he understood that she sometimes knew better than him. He would
ask her advice about things.
He would ask for her advice. She would tell him when she thought that he was wrong. She was very outspoken with them in private. Obviously, in public, she wouldn't necessarily do anything because that would potentially upset the sort of majesty of the king. But in private, she would tell him, what she thought. And she was also known to be very direct. She was sort of a woman of few words, but when she chose those words, they were purposeful. And he took those words seriously.
And this room is a great example of the artistic richness. Richness? Is that the right word?
I mean,
artistic
in Spanish.
Yes. Sometimes I speak Spanglish. It's terrible. Because it's full of portraits of all these people, that we've been talking about. And can you take me through the art that you might see if you go and visit the convent?
Yes. So some of it you'll have seen is from Juana's private collection that was then kept by the convent and actually bequeathed to them when she died. So some of those are portraits of her sister, Maria. She actually kept portraits of both of her siblings and various family members. So there's Maria, there's one of her husband, Maximilian, several of their children. I believe they had 11 children who survived to adulthood, all the archdukes. There were actually so many of them that they had a hard time finding jobs for all of them because they didn't know what to do with some of their younger sons. Various other family members. And then we also get art that is then added in later periods by later Habsburg women, especially Isabella Clara Eugenia, her niece, Philip's daughter, who I'd love to talk about a little bit more because she's one of my personal favorites.
Let's take a look at the time. If this goes on too much, we'll probably have to split it up into two different things. But I think people will listen to both because it's fascinating stuff.
Yeah. I live to entertain as well as educate. What is that called? Edutainment.
Right.
But Isabella Clara Eugenia, to also kind of demonstrate why Philip trusted his sisters, especially Juana, so much. Habsburg women, like I said earlier, were raised to be political agents. They were raised to be these very intellectually prudent women. And Philip raises his two daughters in the same way, especially his eldest daughter, Isabella Clara Eugenia, who was his favorite. Because there was a period of time where they thought that he may never have a son. And so Isabella Clara Eugenia would have been queen regnant.
Right.
Because Philip II gets married 4 times. His first marriage is Maria Manuela, who unfortunately dies in childbirth. His second is Mary Tudor, who he never has a child with. Then his third is Isabella Clara Eugenia and Catalina Micaela's mother. And she then, I believe, also dies as a result of complications in childbirth. But those two daughters, there's a period of 5-6 years where they may be Philip's only children. So he's raising Isabella Clara Eugenia at a very young age to potentially become queen. And then he has 3 sons with his 4th wife, Juana of Austria, the only one of which survives is then Philip III. But there is this extended period where there is the thought that we may have a queen. We may not have a king. So Isabella Clara Eugenia is very close with her father. They have a very tight bond to the point where if you go to visit El Escorial, her quarters are still preserved because of how tight-knit they were. And because she was raised with this potential of becoming queen, which never happened, he actually gives her her own land, essentially. When Philip II is writing up his last will, he puts in it a stipulation for a dowry for Isabella Clara Eugenia. And it includes what we call the Low Countries, which is today Belgium, the Netherlands, Flanders, parts of northern France. And that will be her territory to rule over as sovereign.
Oh, wow.
So she is supposed to inherit that under the stipulation that she gets married, which she does the next year. She marries her cousin, one of Maria's sons, Albert, and they move to the Low Countries and rule as independent sovereigns for 22 years until he dies. The thought was, let's establish a third Habsburg dynasty in the Low Countries, which would be their children. They never had children, but that was sort of the thought of it. Now, fast forwarding, we've got this powerful princess who gets married as a sovereign in her own right. Brussels is this flourishing artistic and intellectual center. She's very independently wealthy. So she petitions the famous painter and artist Peter Paul Rubens to make a series of tapestries. He had just founded a new workshop in Brussels. And so she pays him to do a series of, I believe it's 9 large tapestries. Some of them are 30 feet tall. And then a series of, I believe it was 11 or 12 smaller ones. It takes about a year or 2 for his workshop to actually make all of these because they're colorful and vibrant. And of course, everybody's making these by hand. And instead of keeping those, she sends them to Descalzas Reales as a gift. And they are still there. You can see many of them on display. They're so huge, they actually touch the ground.
Yeah, they're incredible. I've been in and had a look at them.
Yeah, and they're all religious topics that are meant for not only sort of to reinforce that connection between God's majesty and the king's, the royal family's majesty, but also for the contemplation of the nuns.
Right. There's a weird painting there that they showed me just towards the end of the tour, and it was a picture with a little curtain in front of it, and they were supposed to open the curtain, and it was a mirror, but in fact you see a skeletal head behind it, and it's for them to contemplate their vow of poverty, or the fact that they have nothing. But in fact, it's a bit ironic because the whole place is filled with artistic treasures.
Yes, that is one of sort of the great ironies of any religious institution, is that the people who actually live in it and run it usually are taking these vows of poverty, but often they tend to be quite wealthy, especially if you're talking about a Descalzas Reales or an El Escorial, because usually they're aristocrats or royals who brought it in.
And they carry around these little skull things. It's like the things that Japanese girls have on their mobile phones, something kind of hanging off a string. And it's like a cute little skull that they carried around with them.
The original, what are those called? The phone, they're basically like a phone keychain kind of thing.
Yeah.
I haven't seen those. Maybe I have to go back. It's been a while since I've been. I need to.
But yeah, tell me why it's a fantastic place to visit. There's frescoes in the hallway as well.
Yes, and that's actually, there's a kind of fun story about the entrance staircase. So if you go to visit Descalzas Reales, you walk in and there's these kind of dark open rooms with chairs around the sort of outline of it, and not a whole lot really in these first couple of rooms. And then you go to this main staircase, which is all frescoes, all the way up the walls, along the ceiling. It looks like you should be in a palace. Of course, that was through the patronage of a wealthy member of the convent. But what's interesting is that those frescoes are actually quite a bit older. There's an addition to them on the upper left side. So you go up the first staircase to the landing, and then it turns around and there's a second landing. And if you're going up, it's on the right-hand side. They added portraits into the fresco of Philip IV, his last wife, Mariana of Austria, who then became queen regent for her son, and Carlos II is also there, and his sister Margarita.
Mm-hmm.
Those were actually added later.
Yes, I was thinking that it didn't fit in the time frame for me, because I was like, if it was Charles II's palace, why is Philip IV there? He's not born yet.
Yeah, he's not born for 2 more generations, right. And his children are there, so it's towards the end of his reign in the last couple of years. But those were added later through a different patron who wanted to sort of not really update, but to add something to sort of the modern times of this is what the royal family looks like now. And so they're sitting there in like an opera box is what it looks like, as though they're observing the daily goings on of the convent, sort of as a reminder of the royal family is still the patron. They're still making sure that this convent is well taken care of.
Yeah. And you can visit, but it has to be in a Spanish visit. The last time I went, it was all visits in Spanish.
Yes,
still so.
I believe the tours are all still in Spanish, and they are only between very specific times on certain days. So you have to really make sure that you get your ticket kind of ahead of time, not because it's the most popular tourist destination, but because you want to make sure that you actually can go at the time when it is available. The other sort of fun thing is that you have to remember this is still a working convent. There is still nuns that live there and continue on in their spiritual pursuits. So sometimes if you go, you can actually hear them in mass. I went on a day at a specific time slot, and they were having one of the chapels was closed off because they were in contemplation, and they had music, and it was beautiful.
Yeah, I've heard them singing while I passed through. It's incredible. Like, there were about 6 closed convents, I think, in central Madrid, which is just something to contemplate. Were there any other women you wanted to talk about, or anything else that we haven't really covered? I did want to bring up very quickly, do you know about Lope de Vega's daughter?
No.
So Lope de Vega, the famous playwright. And interestingly, women were allowed on the stage in Spain. I was really interested to hear you say that they have more rights, perhaps, than compared to England.
Yes, especially compared to England.
Because women weren't allowed to act in England, and this is kind of contemporary time of Shakespeare. And Lope de Vega had many, many affairs, one with an actress, and he had an illegitimate daughter who he really loved, and she's called Sor Marcela. And if you go to the Lope de Vega house, there's like a portrait of her, because she became a writer. Like he was saying, they had these illegitimate girls were often put into convents because they were a little bit, well, I guess you couldn't marry them off. They're a little bit inconvenient.
Well, there's a little bit more to that, but finish your story.
Okay.
I can add some more about sort of some of the illegitimacy question.
Right. So she went to this convent and she became the abbess. And she used to act in plays as well. And she wrote plays, which is incredible to consider that she had that kind of freedom. And she was in the convent that's in Barrio de las Letras. It's also Descalzas Trinitarios.
Yes, I know exactly where that is. Wow, that's fantastic.
I saw her in an exhibition at the Instituto Cervantes about Siglo de Oro. Female writers have been sort of, their work has been reevaluated, and people are kind of uncovering this, and she was one of them.
Yes, that's actually been it's kind of weird to talk about something being popular in the field in an academic field, but that women writers, especially the golden age sort of era writers, have really been making a resurgence in the last 5 years. Same with painters.
Mhm.
That's why you'll see a lot of exhibitions about Gentileschi and Flemish female painters who were popular with Mary Tudor, and a lot of the ones who eventually went with Catherine of Aragon. One of the first continental female painters in England was actually a Flemish woman who worked for Catherine of Aragon when she was Queen of England. Now, with sort of the way that Spain's laws operated, we're of course talking about really Castile, the Kingdom of Castile, because Spain technically didn't exist. We call it the Spanish monarchy because it was a collective of different kingdoms and their associated territories that all happened to share the same monarch.
Right. They had different tax laws.
They all had different tax laws. They all had different legal requirements. They had their different, what they call the cortes, which were basically these groups of local representatives from the different territories and cities who would come together to pass tax laws. So you have your Cortes de Castilla and Aragon, and there's even a rebellion in 1640 starts in around Barcelona because Philip IV hadn't yet gone to Aragon to officially take up his crown as King of Aragon, because he was supposed to actually go and they weren't coronated, but you were supposed to go and receive the Cortes and take their vows of obedience and all these kinds of things. So when we're talking about Castile in specific, local law codes essentially enshrined certain rights for women. Certain things weren't allowed, like women couldn't testify in court in certain cases, but that also meant that they couldn't be sued for debts. So there was sort of a trade-off of they were allowed certain privileges on account of not having certain rights, but then also if someone required, if they were in court and they required a witness to their good character, a woman could testify in court that way. But because she wasn't allowed to participate in specific legal matters, she was also protected from certain legal procedures. But then she could also own property. Women in certain areas could sue their husbands for bad management, and those husbands would have to actually pay them back.
Does this go back to having had Isabella I as queen?
It actually predates her. These laws go back to actually the Visigoths in around the 7th
That's
century.
quite a long time.
Yes, and we're going all the way back to post-fall of the Roman Empire. The Visigoths actually had a system of equitable inheritance between all children, regardless of gender. And that is then inherited by the Christian kingdoms that then follow, that eventually become Asturias and Castilla and Navarra and all these different places that they just perpetuate because that's the way it's kind of always been. And Spain, up until the end of the 1700s, has laws of equitable inheritance between all children still. So even with aristocratic families, there were laws that you couldn't just give your oldest son everything. Certain things could be taken out, like if you, say, had an oldest son and 2 daughters. First daughter gets married, so she has her dowry. Well, you don't have to give her as much when you die because she's already been given half of her inheritance. Essentially, she's been given the dowry. But if the third daughter doesn't have a dowry, you still have to give her as much as you would give the son. So the children had to be all cared for regardless of age, gender, or, which marriage they came from. And because fathers often died before their wives, there was also a system of female guardianship. So children wouldn't be taken away from their mothers to be raised by, say, a male relative just because she was a woman. Often, husbands would appoint, on their deathbed, husbands would appoint their wives to care for those children until those children came of age. So these women were very used to administrating large patrimonial estates, sometimes multiples at the same time. huge inheritances. I mean, the Mendoza family, who are still very much around, were at one point the wealthiest family in Europe.
Mhm.
They were wealthier than any royal family anywhere in Europe. And they had a series of female guardians who had to account for all of that money.
I love the smile on your face when you're talking about this.
These are the very fun sort of things that we've only really started to unpack in the last 10, 15 years, but that completely upends the sort of idea that we have
Mhm.
about the pre-modern period as being like, oh, women had no power, they had no ability to do anything, they couldn't have their own businesses, they couldn't work outside of the home, which also wasn't true.
Mhm.
But that idea is actually much more modern than the reality was. The sort of cult of domesticity idea is really much more from the Victorian period,
Mm.
where women should just stay at home, not have a job, only go out for social activities, is not the way that people could have survived up until a fairly recent period of time.
No, one of my favorite little snippets about Madrid history is the Button Makers Guild, which is like a really powerful female organization. And they were connected with aristocrats and they got to know all gossip and everything.
Yes, the relationships between female merchants and aristocrats sometimes can be very, very interesting. Not only for the Button Guild one is a very particular feminized space, but you often will have even male merchants, their wives and daughters are often running their shops. And so if an aristocrat or someone who's wealthy comes along and needs, say, 10 plates made of silver, often it is the wives and daughters negotiating that sale.
Mm-hmm.
So they'll be noted often in the documentation because, of course, nobody was really handling physical money. You were owing debts to people. And so the debts would be written down and eventually paid back. So we have often things like 10 arras paid to this silver maker in Bayona. And then it'll also mention his wife, who can also handle the money included in this.
Right. So it's really important. They were literate and they were good at mathematics.
Yes, literate, good at mathematics. They often, and even if they weren't, notaries were sort of a popular thing. So if you couldn't read it, you always could take it to somebody who did and then handle the money afterwards.
Mm-hmm.
So there's a fantastic chapter. I can't remember what book it's in, but it's about sort of lower class women in Triana in Sevilla. So down in the very, very south. But of course, Seville was the sort of trade capital of Spain because that was where all the ships coming in from the Americas went to. They had to go through Seville. So the women in Triana, which is the sort of more working class other side of the river from Seville, these were women who often their husbands were sailors, or they would go to the Americas to try to find their fortunes. And so they often were left behind for long periods of time on their own.
Mm-hmm.
Well, these women are settling debts. They're opening businesses. They're raising their children and providing for their educations. We have all this really interesting, independent information about them that has very little to do with what we stereotypically think of as the women's sphere of marriage, childbirth, and that's kind of it.
This is so good. We could go on forever, but
Yes.
I feel like maybe people should follow you. Are you on social media at all?
Yes, I have my sort of work account on, do we call it X? Do we call it Twitter? Whatever we call it.
I still call it Twitter, but
Yeah, I still think of it as Twitter. I recently changed my handle. So on Twitter, I'm Sea Fish Historian. If you look for Caroline Fishing History, you'll probably find me.
Mm-hmm.
That's where I typically tweet about sort of the process of doing graduate research. And you can see pictures of where I go as I do my sort of archival work. And sometimes I have pictures of archival stuff. Presentations
that
I
stuff
give.
is beautiful. Like the thing that you showed us about the counts in Italy, the handwriting is just insanely gorgeous.
The scribes especially the ones among who were usually employed by either the royal family or the aristocracy, they went to school to learn to be a scribe. So they have the most beautiful handwriting. which admittedly also makes my job easier because it's much easier to read. But also one of my absolute favorite things to look at, I'm actually putting together an academic panel all about women's wills and testaments, which is a whole nother sort of area, because if women could own property, they could also dispense of that property. So they could give it to children. And there's a whole lot of fascinating things about jewelry and relics and property that go through generations of women. But I'm working with another scholar who does French history, mostly medieval French. And she deals with wills that are written in very tiny, almost illegible handwriting. But on the Spanish side, because they're sort of obsessed with paperwork, it's all beautifully written, clearly, big looping handwriting, and it goes on for like 80, sometimes 90 pages. But they're gorgeous to look at.
Fantastic. Okay, well, let's wrap things up by me asking you about Madrid. So,
my favorite place in the world.
What's your favorite off the beaten track secret in Madrid? And it doesn't need to be historical.
I have a very particular favorite bakery. I don't know if we would call it off the beaten path, but every time I've gone, I'm the only one who's there. So maybe it is, maybe it isn't. It's located in Lavapiés. It's La Buena Miga.
I may have seen huge queues outside.
Okay, maybe. Every time I go, nobody's there. But it's a pretty small bakery space, nowhere really to sit down, but they have, in my opinion, the best croissants. Croissant de mantequilla. I usually get 2, and it's right down. It's right down from Mercado de Anton Martin. It's on, I think is that Calle de San Isabel? I think that's
Mercado de Anton Martin is on Calle San Isabel. But I don't know about the road down it.
I think that's the same road. Well, it's down from it, and then if you continue going, you end up on the backside of the Reina Sofia.
Yes, of course, because that road continues.
Yes, yeah. So I usually will stop there, get a croissant or 2, walk down to that plaza right in front of the Reina Sofia, and just people watch. It's one of my favorite things to do.
And isn't the conservatoire, which is on that plaza, also an old monastery? It might be an old monastery because they have the barred windows.
I believe so, but I've never done one of I've been meaning to do. There is a historical tour of Lavapiés, but I haven't done that one.
You can go into the conservatory and see classical concerts sometimes.
Is that where they're having the there's the early modern music concert that's supposed to be going on? Is it there, or is it something?
Could well be, because I've seen early guitar music there, which would have been played in the Spanish court, right?
Yes, that would have been a very common.
So if you nip in and look at the notice board, they have like concerts and stuff advertised.
Absolutely have to.
And then the last thing was, what's your favorite Spanish word or saying?
I have a couple. One of them, which I use for anything that is even slightly inconvenient, doesn't matter if it's a big thing or not. Tener movida, tengo movida, meaning I have a small problem. Anything from I stubbed my toe on the couch to my life is falling apart. Tengo movida. And then the other one is, because of course I am an academic, everything nerdy or geeky is my favorite. So the fact that in Spanish, friki means like nerd or geek culture to me is just so charming. Freaki.
I love friki. That's a great one. And you're going back to the States soon. Will you miss Madrid at all?
Absolutely. When I was here on my Fulbright year, I cried when I learned I had to go back to the States. I miss my family and, my home, but Madrid is my favorite place in the world. I am happiest when I'm here. And so being back, even for this little short research trip has been, it's always my dream to come back. When I land at Barajas, I'm home.
So you may come back at some point in the future.
I'll have to come back for work reasons and hopefully maybe for something longer, but that is all up to the academic career gods.
Okay, well, thank you very much for talking to me. It's been a pleasure.
No, this has been fantastic. Thank you so much.
Okay, cool.